This is part 2 of legislation and service delivery for adults. In part 1, we talked about the early legislation and considered the fact that that legislation leads to the service delivery models. In part 2, we're going to talk about the more modern legislation that has a direct impact on our service. So let's begin. And this brings us to the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. This is the major piece of legislation upon which everything is founded and upon which we still talk about today. There have been many amendments to it, but these amendments are always listed as amendments to the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. It established the Architectural and Transportation Barriers Compliance Board, and that board provides credence to the various types of changes we want to make in the environment in regard to traffic and transportation. It's been influential in our field. It established post-employment services. Those who have finished their training and their service and need additional help and assistance. It mandated consumer involvement in state agency policy, or in other words, providing a means for individuals to become directly involved in policy development. And it established very important sections, 501 to 504, and those were civil rights sections, really precursors to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So let's talk about 501 and 504. 501 is affirmative action in federal hiring, and it says that there can be no discrimination by federal government in its hiring practices. It actually provides an affirmative action program and an annual plan and a report to Congress on those efforts. 502 deals with accessibility. The Architectural and Transportation Barriers Compliance Board, which we said was established, will enforce the accessibility standards. And it established minimum guidelines for buildings that were built or altered with federal funding. 503 is affirmative action by federal contract recipients. Affirmative action on the part of federal contract recipients and subcontractors receiving more than $2,500. In other words, when a contractor working for the government under federal contract, if that contract is above $2,500, they must comply with the affirmative action plan. It also talks about reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities. And an affirmative action plan if there are no more than 50 employers and a contract for over $50,000. And 504, which we often hear about, prohibits exclusion based on a disability of a qualified person with a disability from participation in any federal program or activity. Sounds very similar to the Americans with Disabilities Act, but this has to do with federal funding. And this includes colleges or universities that receive federal funding, and almost every university or college receives federal funding. .508 is the technology portion, and it says that technology that we purchase must be accessible. This may not be tracked as well as it should be because there is a decentralized procurement approach that sometimes interferes, but nevertheless that's very useful. There were amendments, of course, to the Rehabilitation Act in 1974. And in that year, once again, rehabilitation services moved. They were transferred to HEW. The amendments also strengthened the Randolph-Shepard Act and promised increasing numbers of stands. In 1978, there were additional amendments. It expanded the scope of reader services for people who are blind and also of interpreter services. It established the National Institute for Handicapped Research, called NIDR, N-I-D-R-R, and now it is called NIDLR because it includes independent living as well as rehabilitation services, which stands for National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. That organization provides a good deal of funding for the kinds of research that we do in visual impairment and blindness, especially at the adult level. Almost all of our universities have applied for funding under that approach. The amendments established independent living services as part of the state federal rehabilitation program for elderly blind people. Remember that the Voc Rehab Act basically is for people seeking employment, but now we're talking about services for people who are elderly and not seeking employment. We'll talk more about that shortly. And again, it emphasized need for services in developmental disabilities. So Title VII, Chapter 2 of the Act dealt with services for the elderly. And initially, very little was appropriated. In 1995, grants were awarded on a 3-year cycle, half to the states, half were awarded to the states. An average award was only $200,000 until 1995. In 1995, it expanded by about 45%. There were about 48 awards, and they became much greater in terms of their numbers, but not necessarily in the amounts. But it was a start. Those eligible for services under Chapter 2 were people 55 and above who were visually impaired, legally blind, unlikely to be able to obtain gainful employment, but likely to benefit from independent living goals, and in other words, remaining in their own homes rather than going to an institution. And services offered to people in that category included activities of daily living, adaptive skills, adaptive aids and appliances, low vision services, orientation and mobility, communication skills, family and peer counseling, and community integration. So the future of that program, it was changed from a discretionary to a formula grant, with each program receiving a minimum amount of funding based on the population. All right, we're moving to 1979. And in that year, RSA was located in the Department of Education. The Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services, or OSERS, which is now their current home. 1986 saw the Rehabilitation Act amendments, further amendments. And I think one of the most important amendments was that rehabilitation services must be delivered by qualified personnel, although determining who was qualified led to a number of debates. These acts also added supported employment, which meant that rehabilitation workers could work with individuals while they were receiving employment training. It also added the scholarship payback requirement for those individuals in colleges and universities, very similar to the payback agreements that we have today. And it decreased the federal share back from 80%, again back to 75% of the funding from the federal government. So the 25% comes from the states. Then came the most sweeping legislation for persons with disabilities. 1990-1991, the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was really often said to be the civil rights program for persons with disabilities. It was very similar to the legislation that we talked about, 501 to 504, but it was for non-federal funded organizations. There were further amendments to the Rehabilitation Act in 92 and 97, and they established policies that were consistent with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Personal responsibility, self-determination, etc. And the purpose of all of this was to empower those people with disabilities. Then in 1998 comes a major new piece of legislation, the Workforce easy for me to say, the Workforce Investment Act, or WIA. It was Consumer Responsive Job Training and Employment as a system. Let me go back to that. It was meant to provide a seamless workforce system. Much earlier in the 1930s, there was an act called the Wagner-Peiser Act, and it established a public workforce development system. And the Workforce Investment Act of 1998 was a major modernization of that system, authorizing public investments in training and workforce development that suited the demands of that time. And that lasted for quite a while, and it integrated vocational rehabilitation into a more general approach. And then along came the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And it became responsible for all future amendments to the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. And so, this new act has become the law of the land. After 2003, when funding under WIA expired, funding continued through appropriation laws and budget actions until the development of this new act, WIOA. The new regulations in this act strengthen accountability and transparency. They increase access to work-based learning tools, such as apprenticeships. They improve relationships with employers, including through various sector partnerships, and they foster more cohesive planning with economic regions. They also improve access to educational and workforce services for individuals with significant barriers to employment. That would include people with disabilities, certain veterans, disconnected youth, and other populations to help them find work. So it works hand in hand with the Rehabilitation Act by amending the 1973 Rehabilitation Act even further. And it had regulations, most recently in September of 2016, that says the following. It implements limitations on the payment of sub-minimum wages to individuals with disabilities. Remember that some of the early workshops through Industries for the Blind paid sub-minimum wages. This regulation makes that impossible. It places a stress on competitive integrated employment, and it removes homemaker status as well. Various titles of that act: authorization, adult and literary programs, employment as part of One Stop, and One Stop basically means one location for vocational services. As part of this, we have Title IV, which is the reauthorization of the Rehab Act, and then there are general provisions in Title V. Some resources for workers that are often cited that you may want to know about. Through the American Foundation for the Blind, there is Career Connect for job seekers, helping them to find specific positions. VisionAware.org has a great deal of information that's useful. And there is a Transition to Work guide that can be found on the American Foundation for the Blind site as well. So let's now go into some of the models for adult services, based on some of the legislation that we've talked about. There are residential and there are day training programs. And many states have their own training program, and it is a state-sponsored program, and they hire their own O&M specialists, their own vision rehabilitation therapists, their own IT personnel. And that is how they service people, adults who are blind and visually impaired. Other states may have a private system or a combination of a state and a private system. Oftentimes when there is a private system, the state pays private agencies to provide services and authorizes the number of lessons that the person will receive. In those situations, a person would undergo an evaluation period, a report would go to the state, the agency would request a certain number of lessons to provide these services, and the state would provide funding for those lessons. If it's instead a public agency, the state directly provides those lessons. So those are the two main sources of programs in the residential and day programs. Now, those programs may include a lot of services. Oftentimes, it may be as long as a 15-week program as the standard. And of course, this depends on the amount of vision that a person might have. But without any vision, 15 weeks tends to be the standard. So with that kind of a model, orientation and mobility is provided usually on a daily basis for a total of 75 to 85 hours of instruction. Sometimes that many number of hours aren't needed, and sometimes more might be needed. There also may be transition programs for younger people who need help in learning job skills. The goal of these programs are competitive employment in integrated settings. That means not in a sheltered workshop, and it means in working in a facility where people are also employed who do not have disabilities. So typical programs may include work evaluation, work adjustment, work training, vocational counseling, vision rehabilitation therapy, and orientation and mobility. And there, of course, are other services. Social work may be one of them, along with other specialties. There are Ability One programs. And as we've seen, this is part of National Industries for the Blind. In the Ability One programs, there's an emphasis on work skills. Those programs must be self-sufficient. They do not gain funding from the federal government because they are not competitive employment in integrated settings. But some programs have a forward-looking vision and have created rehabilitation components. For example, Winston-Salem in this state provides low vision services to help people with their independent needs. Industries of the Blind in Greensboro provides orientation and mobility services. So those are possibilities as well. Randolph-Shepard programs, as we've mentioned from earlier legislation, the state provides the training, evaluates those individuals, and helps them find stands. And it is a very good living. Many blind and visually impaired people find that to be an excellent source of income. We've talked about the veterans programs. Probably the strongest service in the nation is through the Veterans Administration, serving veterans. The VIST and the BROS programs really provide services in local communities, and the residential programs are at the hospitals, such as Hines and New Haven and other hospitals where resources are plentiful and services are very, very strong. One additional issue is third-party reimbursement. Visual impairment and blindness was built around an independent model, not a medical model. Under the medical model, physicians dictate to practitioners what they will provide and the number of lessons. For example, an occupational therapist or a physical therapist functions under a medical model. Prescription is written by a physician for certain services, and a certain number of lessons are provided. In the field of visual impairment and blindness, that is not the model. And instead, we have more of an education model, and consequently, third-party reimbursement is not a strong portion of what we experience. However, there is a movement to gain third-party reimbursement, and our professional organization, AER, Association for the Education and Rehabilitation of the Blind and Visually Impaired, has a committee working very hard on trying to establish third-party reimbursement. So that's where we stand in terms of legislation and service delivery models.